In the vast and opulent palace of Emperor Valtor, the air was thick with tension. The Emperor, a towering figure of strength and authority, had ruled the Zadar Empire with an iron fist for decades. His vast wealth, intelligence, and power were unmatched, but none of that seemed to matter when it came to his rage. Valtor's temper was legendary, fiercer than any warrior, and colder than the northern winds that blew across his empire's borders. The heart of the palace was the Dragon's Chamber, a massive room that housed a creature of unimaginable terror, the Emperor's dragon Ferox. Ferox was not merely a beast. He was a living embodiment of destruction, his scales the color of smoldering embers, eyes glowing with fiery intensity. The dragon had been bound to the Emperor's service for as long as anyone could remember. Ferox was a loyal companion, but his fury could be a devastating force if ever unleashed. Today, something had triggered that fury. No one was certain what had caused it. Some whispered that a failed diplomatic meeting with neighboring kingdoms had set the beast off, while others speculated that the dragon had been disturbed by some deep, unspoken conflict within its own ancient mind. Regardless of the reason, Ferox was rampaging. His massive form thrashed about the dragon's chamber, knocking over statues, tearing through golden tapestries, and sending echoes of his roars through the palace halls. Palace servants, advisors, and even the most skilled knights had tried to calm Ferox. They had entered the chamber with gifts, words of peace, and even the Emperor's own voice, calling out in a desperate plea, but nothing worked. Every attempt ended in failure, and worse. Those who had dared approach the dragon were left trembling in terror, their minds shattered by the sheer force of his presence. The Emperor himself stood at the edge of the chamber, his eyes narrowed, his posture as cold and composed as ever. His heart pounded not from fear of the dragon but from frustration. For all his might, wealth, and influence, he could not control the creature that had served him for so long. Ferox had always been obedient, but now it was as though the dragon was beyond his grasp. The advisors around him muttered amongst themselves, their faces drawn with worry. "Your Majesty?" One of them spoke hesitantly. "Perhaps it would be best to send for reinforcements. A larger force could subdue the beast." Valtor's gaze turned to the advisor with cold contempt. "You think I cannot control my own dragon? I do not need an army to do what should be within my power." The advisors fell silent, each man looking at the ground, too afraid to speak. Valtor's reputation as a leader was unchallenged, and yet in this one instance his pride faltered. The roar of the dragon echoed through the palace once more, shaking the very foundations. Valtor clenched his fists. This was his greatest test. He was the Emperor of the Zadar Empire, but even he couldn't subdue his own dragon. But then a voice from the back of the room caught his attention. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it was unmistakable. "I can help." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Standing at the entrance to the chamber was a young woman. Her name was Ilara, a maid who had only recently entered the Emperor's service. She was an ordinary human by all accounts, her small stature, plain brown hair, and simple attire making her blend in easily among the more elegant courtiers and soldiers. But there was something in her eyes, something that sparked a glimmer of courage. Valtor's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking from Ilara to the raging dragon. You think you can tame Ferox?" he asked with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Ilara nodded slowly, stepping forward with a calmness that seemed completely at odds with the chaos around her. "I do not claim to be a warrior, Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady. "But I have a gift that allows me to reach out to creatures, to understand them." The Emperor's brow furrowed. He had heard rumors of humans with unusual abilities, but he had never believed them. The people of his empire were not known for their magic or powers, at least, not in the way that the mystics of other lands were. "I have seen the way the animals in the palace respond to you, Ilara." Another advisor spoke up, his voice cautious. "But this is not an animal. This is a dragon." "I know," Ilara replied softly. "But sometimes the greatest strength lies not in brute force but in understanding." Valtor's lips curled into a thin smile, though there was no humor in it. He didn't believe her. No human had ever calmed Ferox, and no one had ever dared to try. Yet something in Ilara's demeanor intrigued him. Perhaps it was her unwavering calm, her willingness to stand before the Emperor and the dragon, or perhaps it was simply the desperation of the situation that made him consider her words. "Very well," Valtor said, his tone as cold as ever. You may try, but if you fail, you will be removed from the palace immediately. No one makes a fool of the Emperor. Ilara bowed her head respectfully. I understand, Your Majesty. With that, she stepped forward, her small figure barely visible beneath the massive shadows of the dragon. The air grew hotter as she walked toward the creature, and Ferox's glowing eyes locked onto her with a deadly intensity. His jaws parted, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth, and his tail swished in fury, knocking over a golden urn. Ilara stopped just outside the dragon's reach, her hands clasped in front of her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the searing heat and the overwhelming presence of the dragon. I'm not here to fight you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm not here to control you. I just want to understand you. For a moment, nothing happened. Ferox's glowing eyes narrowed further, his massive form shifting slightly, but he made no move to attack. Ilara continued, speaking softly and slowly, her words flowing like a melody. She spoke of calm seas, of the wind in the trees, of peace and understanding, words that made no sense in the midst of such chaos, but somehow seemed to reach the heart of the beast. And then something unexpected occurred. Ferox's roars began to soften, his thrashing slowing as if the fury inside him was gradually fading. His eyes no longer burned with the same intensity. Instead, they seemed calmer, more watchful. The Emperor watched in stunned silence. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Ilara, the human maid, was doing what none of his advisors nor his best warriors had managed. She was calming Ferox. And as the dragon's anger slowly ebbed, Valtor felt a strange sense of relief. Perhaps there was more to this girl than anyone had realized. Perhaps humanity had something to offer his empire after all. But as the tension in the chamber began to settle, Valtor could not help but wonder. What exactly had Ilara done to achieve such a feat? What was her true power? And more importantly, what would it mean for the future of the Empire and for the Emperor himself? For the first time in a long while, Valtor felt something unfamiliar. Hope. After the extraordinary events in the Dragon's Chamber, Ilara's reputation spread through the halls of the palace like wildfire. People could scarcely believe that a simple human maid had done what even the most skilled dragon tamers had failed to do. She had calmed Ferox, the Emperor's dragon, a creature whose rage had once seemed unstoppable. The palace buzzed with questions, curiosity, and awe. The Emperor himself had remained silent about the incident, his cold demeanor giving nothing away. He had ordered Ilara to remain in her usual position as a maid, but his thoughts about her were anything but ordinary. Valtor could not understand how a young woman, with no military training or magical abilities, had succeeded where the greatest minds and warriors of his empire had failed. For days after, Ferox remained calm, his once furious roars now replaced with a quiet, watchful patience. It was as though the dragon had undergone a transformation, a change that could only have been caused by Ilara's strange, soothing presence. Still, the Emperor's curiosity was not satisfied. He needed answers. One evening, after the sun had set and the palace was bathed in soft moonlight, Valtor summoned Ilara to the royal chambers. She entered with her head slightly bowed, her hands clasped together just as she always did. The Emperor sat at his desk, looking over some documents, but his eyes were fixed on her as she stepped forward. Come closer. Ilara, Valtor commanded, his deep voice carrying across the room. She obeyed, standing before him with the same composed demeanor she had shown when facing the dragon. I must know something, Valtor said, setting down his papers and leaning forward. His intense eyes locked onto hers. How did you do it? How did you calm Ferox when no one else could? Ilara hesitated for a moment, her gaze dropping to the floor. She had expected this question, and yet she wasn't sure how to answer it. Her gift was not something she had ever fully understood herself. It had always been a quiet whisper, a feeling, a bond that existed between her and the world around her, especially animals. She took a deep breath before speaking. It's not something I can explain easily, Your Majesty. I have a connection. It's not magic or power, but a way of understanding. Animals, especially those like Ferox, they carry emotions too. Rage, fear, sadness, they are not so different from us. I simply reached out to him, tried to listen to what he was feeling. The anger he felt wasn't his alone. It was something deep inside him, something he could no longer control. I just helped him find peace again. Valtor listened closely, his brow furrowed in thought. He was not a man easily impressed, but there was something in her words that struck a chord. He had always thought of creatures like ferox as nothing more than tools, powerful, dangerous, and useful. But Ilara spoke of them as living beings, with feelings and struggles of their own. Tell me, Valtor continued, his voice softer now. Have you done this before? Have you calmed other beasts? Ilara nodded slowly. I have, but only small creatures, nothing like ferox. I've always had a way with animals. It's not something I can control. It just happens. It's not my will that does it, but theirs. The Emperor leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. There was something else he needed to know. Why did you come to the palace, Ilara? Why did you choose to serve me? Ilara's eyes flickered with uncertainty. It was a question she had been asked many times before, but the truth was far more complicated than any simple answer. She had come to the palace as a refugee, escaping the horrors of war that had ravaged her village. The Zadar Empire was known for its might and wealth, and it had seemed like the only place where she could find safety. She had no family left, no home to return to. I had nowhere else to go, Your Majesty, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I came here to survive. I never expected any of this. For a moment, the Emperor stared at her in silence. The weight of her words hung in the air. She was not here for power, glory, or riches. She was simply trying to find a place in the world just like any other person. Valtor's thoughts shifted. He had ruled for so long with an iron fist, controlling every aspect of his empire with absolute authority. But in this young woman, he saw something different. A connection to the world that he had long forgotten, something raw and pure. I find it intriguing, Valtor said, his voice thoughtful, that you, a mere maid, can possess such power. Perhaps I have underestimated humanity. Ilara did not speak, but her heart quickened. She had never considered herself powerful, and yet the Emperor seemed to think otherwise. She was just a simple woman, doing what she could to survive in a world that often felt beyond her control. I want you to do something for me, Valtor continued, his voice now tinged with authority. Ferox is my greatest ally, but also my greatest challenge. If you can control him, I believe you can control other forces, forces that may one day threaten this empire. I want you to train, learn how to strengthen your abilities. Do this, and I will make you more than a maid. I will make you an advisor to the throne. Ilara was taken aback. She had never imagined being more than a servant in the palace. The idea of becoming an advisor to the Emperor was beyond anything she could have hoped for. I don't know how to do that, Your Majesty, she stammered. Valtor's lips curved into a faint smile. You will learn. I will provide you with the resources you need. You will train with the finest scholars and mystics in the Empire. Together we will unlock your potential. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. She had come to the palace seeking safety, but now she was being thrust into a world of power and politics. She didn't know if she was ready for such responsibility. But one thing was certain. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. And as she looked into the Emperor's eyes, something told her that her destiny was no longer just about survival. It was about shaping the future of the Empire, and perhaps even changing the course of history. As the conversation drew to a close, the Emperor stood, his imposing figure towering over her. I expect great things from you, Ilara. Do not disappoint me. With a nod, Ilara turned to leave, her mind swirling with the implications of what had just happened. The weight of her new role pressed down on her, but there was also a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could change the Empire in ways she had never imagined. As Ilara exited the royal chambers, her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see a figure approaching, a familiar face. It was Ferox. The dragon's massive form loomed in the hallway, his glowing eyes locked onto hers. He had not forgotten her, and for the first time in her life, Ilara realized that she too might never forget the dragon. The days that followed Ilara's meeting with Emperor Valtor were filled with a new kind of anticipation. What had once been a life of simplicity and routine as a maid in the palace had suddenly transformed into something much more complicated. She had agreed to train, to learn how to control her ability, though she still didn't fully understand it herself. At first, Ilara's training took place in the quietest corners of the palace. She spent hours with the palace's scholars who were intrigued by her ability to connect with animals, particularly the mighty dragon Ferox. The mystics and sages, however, were more skeptical. They told her that what she had done was impossible, that there were no records of humans ever taming such beasts. Yet they couldn't deny the reality of her success. Every day she sat with them in dim-lit rooms filled with ancient scrolls, listening to their teachings. But none of their methods seemed to make sense for her. Ilara wasn't learning magic or power in the way they expected. Instead, she was learning to trust herself, to deepen the quiet connection she had with the world around her. The more she practiced, the more she understood that her gift wasn't about controlling others. It was about understanding them. The Emperor, in his cold, authoritative way, had insisted she continue the training, but there were times when Ilara felt like she was in over her head. She wasn't sure what Valtor saw in her. She was just a girl who had come to the palace seeking refuge, and yet now, she was at the center of something far bigger than herself. One particular afternoon, after a long day of studying in the library, Ilara found herself walking through the palace gardens. The garden had always been her favorite part of the palace, the trees, the flowers, and the soft sounds of nature were a welcome contrast to the cold marble walls of the royal halls. As she wandered through the lush greenery, she noticed Ferox perched in a secluded part of the garden, his massive body resting against the base of a tall stone statue. The dragon's glowing eyes followed her every movement, but there was no hint of hostility in his gaze. He was watching her, waiting. Ilara paused, uncertain. It had been days since she had last approached him directly. She had been busy with her training, and Ferox seemed content to observe her from a distance. But now, with nothing but the cool evening air around her, Ilara felt a quiet pull in her chest. She had to try again. With a deep breath, she slowly walked toward the dragon, keeping her movement steady and calm. The soft crunch of her shoes against the gravel path was the only sound as she approached. "Ferox," she murmured gently, her voice soft but clear. "I know you don't fully understand me, but I'm here to listen." For a moment, the dragon remained still, his eyes watching her intently. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let fear take over. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. To her surprise, Ferox slowly shifted his massive body, making room for her to sit beside him. The dragon's movements were cautious, almost as if he were waiting for her to make the next move. Ilara sat down on the soft grass, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his enormous form, but far enough to remain safe. She closed her eyes, her hands resting in her lap. She had learned something important in her training. Connecting with others, whether human or animal, wasn't just about words. It was about feeling, sensing what others were going through without needing to speak. For several moments, Ilara simply sat there, breathing in the cool evening air. She focused on the sensation of the ground beneath her and the rhythm of her own breathing. As she did, she began to feel a strange warmth emanating from Ferox. It wasn't the fiery heat she had felt when he was enraged, but a steady, calm warmth like the sun on a cool morning. She opened her eyes and looked up at the dragon. His glowing gaze met hers, not with anger or aggression, but with something else: curiosity. Ilara slowly reached out a hand, palm facing upwards, not to touch him, but to offer a gesture of trust. For a long moment there was no response. Ferox continued to stare at her, his eyes gleaming in the fading light. Then ever so slowly he lowered his massive head toward her. The dragon's breath was warm against her skin and Ilara's heart raced. She didn't flinch, though. She stayed calm, trusting her instinct. The dragon's enormous snout hovered just inches from her hand, and she could feel the immense power that lay beneath his calm exterior. Ferox wasn't just a dragon. He was a creature of legend, one whose very presence could command the earth to tremble. The air between them felt charged, but not with the same violent energy that had filled the dragon's chamber weeks before. This was different. This was a connection, Ilara whispered again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand you, Ferox, I do. I'm not here to control you. I just want to help you." It was an almost impossible thing, trying to reach the heart of such a creature, and yet Ilara felt something stir in her, something deep within her chest. It was a feeling of hope, of connection, that she had never experienced before. She wasn't just a servant, a maid in the Emperor's palace. She was someone who could make a difference. After a few long moments, Ferox let out a deep, rumbling sigh. The heat of his breath enveloped her, but it was warm and soothing, not destructive. The dragon slowly withdrew his head and sat back on his haunches, still watching her with those glowing eyes, but now, there was something different in them, a quiet respect. Ilara smiled softly, feeling an incredible sense of accomplishment. She hadn't just calmed Ferox, she had created a bond with him. A bond that went beyond power or fear. It was a bond built on trust. As Ilara stood to leave, she looked over her shoulder at the dragon. "Thank you, Ferox," she whispered. "Thank you for trusting me." And with that, she walked back toward the palace, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She had proven something to herself today. She wasn't just the human maid. She was someone who could understand the hearts of creatures, even the most fearsome dragon. Unbeknownst to Ilara, however, her bond with Ferox would change more than just her future. It would change the future of the entire empire. The Emperor had been watching from a distance, his sharp gaze never leaving the scene. Valtor had seen what had happened. He had seen how Ferox, the unstoppable dragon, had softened at Ilara's touch. And in that moment, the Emperor realized that Ilara was more than just a tool to tame his dragon. She was the key to something far greater. Days turned into weeks, and Ilara's bond with Ferox grew stronger. The palace, once a place of cold marble and imposing silence, now felt warmer to her. She spent hours in the palace gardens with the dragon, slowly gaining his trust with every gesture and word. The once ferocious beast was no longer a symbol of terror, but of something more complex. He was a creature of strength, yes, but also one of deep emotion, hidden beneath layers of fire and rage. The Emperor had watched from a distance, his sharp gaze never straying from Ilara's interactions with Ferox. At first, he had been unsure whether to believe what was happening before his very eyes. But as the days passed, he had seen the undeniable change in the dragon's demeanor. Ferox, once a creature capable of bringing entire kingdoms to their knees with a single roar, had calmed. He no longer raged with fiery wrath. Instead, he seemed thoughtful, even serene at times. Valtor had come to one inescapable conclusion. Ilara was a force to be reckoned with. She wasn't just taming Ferox. She was doing something far more extraordinary. She was connecting with him in a way that no one, no matter how skilled, had ever been able to. But for all the peace that had settled between Ilara and Ferox, the rest of the empire was anything but calm. Whispers filled the halls of the palace. Some spoke of Ilara's powers as if she were a sorceress. Others feared that she had some hidden agenda. The Emperor, ever so protective of his authority, knew that such rumors could be dangerous. The more Ilara succeeded, the more others would question his control. It wasn't just the rumors within the palace that concerned him. News had begun to reach his ears about unrest among the border regions of his empire. Rebel forces seeking to tear down the Emperor's reign had started to grow bolder. They had made several attacks on small towns, and their numbers were swelling. It was only a matter of time before they would challenge the Emperor's rule in a much more dangerous way. Valtor needed a solution. He had long relied on his military might, but in the face of growing rebellion, he realized that sheer force might not be enough. The answer lay in Ferox. He had always known the dragon was powerful, one of the last of his kind, a living weapon of mass destruction. But what if Ilara's connection to the beast could be used for more than just taming? What if she could control Ferox in battle? One evening, Valtor called Ilara to his chambers. It was the first time he had spoken to her alone in days. As she entered the room, her hands clasped before her, she was met with the Emperor's intense gaze. "You have done well, Ilara," Valtor began, his voice steady and commanding. "Ferox has calmed under your care, but now I have a new task for you. There are rebels gathering along the borders of the Empire. They threaten everything I have built. I need Ferox to fight for me, and I need you to command him." Ilara's heart sank as she realized the true weight of the Emperor's request. She had spent weeks gaining Ferox's trust, learning his ways and developing a bond with him. But commanding him in battle was a different thing entirely. She had never thought of using her connection with the dragon for such a purpose. I don't know if I can do that, Your Majesty," she said softly, her voice filled with hesitation. "Ferox is not just a tool to be used. He's a living being. I don't want to control him in that way." The Emperor's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "You misunderstand me, Ilara. I do not ask you to control him like a slave. I ask you to lead him. You have the power to communicate with him. I need you to use that power to help protect the Empire." Ilara's mind raced. She had never imagined that her gift could be used for war. She had always seen it as something peaceful, something to heal, to calm, but now she was being asked to use it in the service of destruction. "But what if he doesn't want to fight?" Ilara asked, her voice shaking. "What if he refuses?" Valtor's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You have earned Ferox's trust, Ilara. I believe you can convince him to fight. But time is running out. The rebels will not wait for you to decide." Ilara stood in silence for a long time, weighing the Emperor's words. She had no love for war. She had seen its horrors firsthand when her village had been destroyed. But she also knew that the Zadar Empire under Valtor's rule had given her safety when she had nowhere else to go. Her life had been saved by this empire, by this emperor. Could she really turn her back on it now? With a heavy heart, she finally spoke. "I will do it. But I won't force Ferox. If he refuses, then we will find another way." Valtor nodded, his lips curling into a slight smile. "I knew you would see reason." The next day, Ilara made her way to the garden where Ferox often rested. She had spent so much time there in peace, but now, the weight of the Emperor's words pressed heavily on her shoulders. She found the dragon lying in the same spot, his enormous wings folded against his sides. His eyes opened as she approached, his gaze locking onto hers. "Ferox," she called softly, kneeling beside him. "The Emperor wants us to fight. There are rebels at the borders. They are threatening the Empire, and he wants you to fight with him." Ferox's massive head lifted slightly, his glowing eyes narrowing. Ilara could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken question between them. She continued, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "I don't want this. I never wanted you to be a weapon. But the Emperor is asking for your help. He believes you can win this war." For a moment, there was only silence. Ferox did not move, his gaze fixed on Ilara. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her as if the dragon was weighing her words, sensing her true feelings. "I don't want you to fight unless you choose to," Ilara said quietly. "I will never force you to do something you don't want to do." Ferox shifted his position slightly, his large body moving with a slow grace. The fire in his eyes flickered, and for the first time since they had formed their bond, Ilara saw something other than rage in his gaze, an understanding. It was as though Ferox had heard her, not just with his ears, but with his very being. The dragon lowered his head to the ground, and for a moment, Ilara thought he might reject the idea entirely. But then, to her surprise, Ferox let out a low, rumbling growl, his massive tail swishing behind him. It was not the sound of anger, but of resolve. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. She understood. Ferox was not refusing to fight. He was simply making a decision to fight, but on his own terms. And as Ilara stood beside him, she knew that she had not just tamed a beast. She had earned the respect of one of the most powerful creatures in the world. With a deep breath, Ilara rose to her feet. "Then we will fight together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ilara knew that her life had changed forever. She had walked into the palace as a simple maid, but now she was a key figure in the fate of an empire. The bond between her and Ferox was not just one of taming. It was a partnership that would shape the future of the Zadar Empire. And as the shadows grew longer, Ilara prepared for the battle that would test everything she had learned and everything she believed in. The day of the battle arrived faster than Ilara had anticipated. News of the approaching rebel forces spread quickly, and the Emperor had ordered his army to prepare. The streets of the capital buzzed with nervous energy, as soldiers geared up and civilians huddled in their homes, praying that the Emperor's forces would be victorious. Ilara stood in the palace garden once more, gazing out toward the horizon. Ferox stood beside her, his massive form casting a long shadow across the ground. The dragon's glowing eyes were focused, sharp, and alert, but there was something else there as well, an understanding that was deeper than anything Ilara had ever felt before. They were in this together. The thought of using Ferox as a weapon still troubled her, but Ilara knew there was no turning back. The Emperor's forces needed them. The Empire needed them. And, most importantly, the people, many of whom had been forced to live under constant fear of rebellion, needed the safety the Emperor promised. But she had also learned something else during her time with Ferox. She would never treat him as a mere tool. not even in the face of war. "Ferox," she said softly, her voice steady. "This is our fight, not because we are ordered to, but because we choose to protect this empire, together." The dragon turned his head, meeting her gaze with a calmness that comforted her. His response was not in words, but in the slow movement of his tail, a reassuring gesture of partnership. It was clear to Ilara now that Ferox was not just fighting for the Emperor, nor was he fighting for her. He was fighting for the balance of the world he inhabited, a world that needed order. With a deep breath, Ilara turned toward the palace. She had learned what she needed. She wasn't just Ferox's guide anymore. She was his partner. And together, they would face whatever the battle ahead threw at them. The battlefield lay stretched before them as the Emperor's army gathered in formation. The soldiers stood in neat rows, their armor gleaming in the morning sun. A tense quiet had settled over the field, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Valtor stood at the front of his forces, his cold eyes scanning the horizon. He had never been a man to show fear, but even he could not deny the weight of the coming conflict. The rebel forces were numerous, and their leader, a man named Kalen, was known for his ruthlessness. He had amassed an army that was determined to overthrow the Emperor's rule, and the Zadar Empire had not faced an internal rebellion of this magnitude in over a century. The Emperor's mind was focused on the task at hand, but there was a small uneasy part of him that kept turning back to Ilara. He had come to rely on her strange connection with Ferox. But in the end, it would be Ferox who would decide whether to fight or not. From behind, Ilara approached with Ferox by her side. The dragon's massive form seemed to darken the battlefield as he moved forward, his scales gleaming like molten lava under the sun. The soldiers parted, watching in awe and fear as the creature advanced, his every step shaking the ground beneath them. At Ilara's side, the Emperor turned to her, his face unreadable. "You've done well, Ilara. Now show me what you've taught him." Ilara nodded, her throat tight. She had done everything in her power to prepare Ferox for this moment, but there was always a lingering fear. Would it be enough? Would the dragon truly fight, and if so, would it be on his own terms? She took a step forward, her hand gently resting against Ferox's side. She had never felt such a powerful bond with any creature before, and yet in this moment, she knew that her connection with the dragon was more than just an alliance. It was a shared purpose. Ilara closed her eyes for a moment and focused, reaching out to the dragon through their bond. She could feel his heartbeat, the warmth of his presence, and the strength in his every breath. "He was ready. Ferox," she whispered, her voice steady. "It's time." With a low growl, Ferox rose up on his hind legs, his massive wings unfurling, creating gusts of wind that sent dust and debris flying across the battlefield. His eyes glowed brighter than ever, and Ilara felt a wave of power surge through her. This was not the same creature she had first met, a creature of rage and anger. This was a dragon with a sense of purpose, and with her by his side he would fight with honor. From the other side of the field, Kalen's army appeared, advancing with shields raised and weapons drawn. Their war cries filled the air as they prepared to face the Emperor's forces. Valtor raised his sword high. "For the Empire," he shouted. With that, the battle began. The clash of steel against steel echoed across the field as the two armies collided. The ground trembled beneath the force of the fighting, and the sounds of screams, shouts, and the ring of swords created a chaotic symphony of war. But amidst the clash, Ferox let out a deafening roar, shaking the very earth beneath him. Ilara watched as the dragon charged forward, his wings flapping with incredible force, lifting him into the sky. Ferox's sheer presence on the battlefield was enough to cause a wave of panic among the enemy forces. His roar was not one of fury but of power, a declaration that he was not to be underestimated. Ferox dove into the fray, his massive claws cutting through the air with precision, striking down soldiers with terrifying accuracy. His fiery breath scorched the earth, turning the battlefield into a blazing inferno. But despite the chaos around them, Ilara kept her focus, guiding Ferox through the fight. She knew that their bond was what made them strong. Not just the dragon's power, but the trust they had in each other. Kalen's forces, though numerous, were no match for the might of the dragon. With every strike of Ferox's tail, the enemy's lines faltered, and with each blast of his fire, soldiers fell in waves. The rebels began to retreat, their morale shattered by the overwhelming force they faced. But Kalen was not one to back down so easily. The rebel leader, a tall figure clad in dark armor, rode forward on a massive warhorse, his sword raised high. He was determined to make one final stand against the Emperor's forces, and he would not be intimidated by a dragon. "Ilara," the Emperor called from behind her. "We need to end this." "Guide Ferox to Kalen. Only then will this battle be won." Ilara's heart raced. She knew what was at stake. With a deep breath, she called out to Ferox, guiding him toward the rebel leader. The dragon, sensing the challenge ahead, narrowed his eyes and let out a deafening roar. The two forces met in the center of the battlefield. Kalen, with his sword raised, prepared for a final strike. But Ferox was faster. With a swipe of his massive claw, the dragon knocked the rebel leader from his horse. Kalen landed with a heavy thud, his sword slipping from his grasp. Ilara stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "This battle is over," she said firmly. "The people will be safe." With one last terrifying growl, Ferox bared his teeth at the defeated rebel leader, who now lay on the ground, helpless. The dragon was not here for vengeance. He had fought to protect, and now, the threat was vanquished. Kalan, seeing the defeat in his eyes, raised his hands in surrender. "You have won," he said, his voice hoarse. "But remember this, rebellion is like fire. It can never be fully extinguished." With that, the battlefield fell silent, the echoes of war fading into the distance. The Emperor's forces had triumphed, but it was clear that the battle had changed something within all of them. Ilara turned to the Emperor, her heart still racing from the intensity of the battle. He approached her, his usual coldness softened by the victory they had just achieved. "You were right," Valter said quietly. "You and Ferox, together you have changed the course of this empire." Ilara smiled faintly, looking at the dragon beside her. "We fought together. This was our victory, not just mine." And as the smoke cleared over the battlefield, Ilara knew that her place in the empire had changed forever. No longer just a maid, she had become something greater, a protector, a leader, and a partner to the most powerful creature in the world. The future of the Xidar Empire lay ahead, and with Ferox by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.